Hey, how's it going, guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Georgie and I'm your friendly neighborhood anime and manga fan. I love all things anime and all things manga, and I'm here today with a very special video of a breakdown slash video essay surrounding the entirety of part 2. We're going to talk about all the good things, all the bad things, and pretty much do a whole memory lane of the entirety of part 2, talk about how it started, how it ended, and how we got to the point that we got at the end where, in my opinion, it was a very lackluster ending, and how, in my opinion, it feels like the ending of this part 2 of Chainsaw Man not just tarnishes the legacy of part 2, but also the entirety of the series, because in my opinion, I think the ending was very lackluster, and I have a lot of things to say about it, surrounding it, and pretty much I want to go one by one from the beginning of the story to the end and give you guys a whole video essay surrounding the entirety of part 2 and its mistakes, it's some of the big ups in part 2, a lot of the greatness in part 2, and a lot of the garbage surrounding the ending, specifically the last act of the story. Now, before I go any further with this, video breakdown slash review, I just wanted to give you guys a quick reminder to make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you guys get me up to date with all my Chainsaw Man as well as all my anime and manga content that I'll be providing in this channel. It really helps out a lot, and I would really appreciate it if you guys could subscribe to my YouTube channel. So if you guys could, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about Chainsaw Man Part 2. So, right from the get-go, Chainsaw Man Part 2 takes place a couple of years after Fujimoto had finished Part 1. Not necessarily in the world of Chainsaw Man. I think it's like around a year's time since Chainsaw Man 1 ended. But I'm talking about the real world. So I'm giving you guys a little bit of background of how we got to Part 2. So after Part 1 ended, Fujimoto, he took a break for a while. Then he proceeded to write Goodbye Eri, which is a phenomenal series, or a one-shot manga that I love. It's like in my top 10 mangas of all time. And after that being released, I was very excited for part 2 because I was like, okay, Fujimoto, he knows what he's doing. I have full control, trust of this guy. This guy cannot do any wrongs. And especially after reading Goodbye Eri, I was like, man, this is an emotional journey of a story. And I'm very certain that once part 2 comes out, because part 2 was coming out a couple of months after Goodbye Eri. So I was like, very assured that, okay, part 2 will be in good hands. And to be honest, for the first, at minimum, half of the story, yes, I think once we got introduced to the first chapter, which let's talk about the first chapter, part 2. Once from the get-go, as soon as we get introduced to a new character, which in my opinion was one of the better characters in the story in retrospect, Asa. Once we get introduced to the character of Asa, right from the get-go, Fujimoto does an exceptional job at pretty much making you fall in love with her, where you're just like, man, you sympathize with her. You feel like, oh, she's she's a character that not many people can relate to in the sense of the school setting. She's a kind of a loner, and she's very realistic. Like, that's the thing with Fujimoto, he makes his characters feel really realistic, and Asa was no mistake from that. She was a 100% genuine character that I think a lot of people could relate to, specifically in the way that she carried herself, the way that she saw others, the way that she pretty much pursued everybody around her to look at her. And what we see from the point we're getting introduced, you already know that this girl Asa is gonna have something bad happen to her. It's already set up, with the Bucky, the chicken devil, and as all that is happening, the events transpire that eventually lead us to the introduction of Yoru, which I'm just gonna say it right now. I think Yoru's introduction to the story is one of the best introductions to an antagonist in not just modern day shonen, but I would say in all of shonen, because I remember reading the chapter where she gets introduced, the very first chapter, where she after she defeats the devil that, Asa's teacher takes the form of, while she's sitting on, its corpse, she's like, I'm gonna make you throw up bombs. I'll make sure to make you throw up nuclear bombs, Chainsaw Man. Like she just had aura. Like Yoru as a character, I was like, like if Denji pulls up against this chick, this is gonna be a threat. This is gonna be a bad news for Denji. And pretty much as the story continued, at least in the first arc of the story, we get more developments between Asa and Yoru's relationship, which, Yoru gives us a lot of lore. She introduces us to the whole, the horsewoman of the apocalypse. We had already been, shown to Makima in part 1, the control devil. So a lot of people speculating when part 2 came out, specifically when Yoru got introduced, the war devil. So then people were like, oh, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, these are going to be the main players in part 2. And for the most part, they were, at least initially, because if you go back to read the beginning of part 2, especially weekly like I was, or bi-weekly when, every chapter will come out every 2 weeks for the beginning, a lot of the time in the fandom, we were all very ecstatic about the whole aspect of like, oh, the four horsewomen, this is gonna be insane. And Yoru's, like the following the antagonist of the story, pretty much in Asa, trying to track down the previous protagonist of the story in Denji. That was a very cool twist in the story that I was very much fascinated by it. So as the story continued, and we got more of Asa and Yoru's relationship and their dynamic, I was like, okay, this is great. Like this is awesome. Like I like the aspect of Asa taking the steering wheel, but then Yoru taking the steering wheel at times. The back and forward. So it was like a 50-50, similar to like the Hulk in Marvel, where Banner has to trust the Hulk, and the Hulk sometimes needs to be calmed down by Banner. I like that the economy between these two characters, and I think a lot of people did, because that was one of the main the main things that people enjoyed about Asa and Yoru's dynamic, like the back and forward, the tug of war about, controlling the body. And as all that was happening, we also get introduced to other characters that, at the beginning we were thinking, oh, they're just going to be whatever characters, not really big players. And this is where I knew part two, at least in the beginning, I was like, okay, Fujimoto is a different breed of an author, because he does some wild stuff. And some wild stuff he does indeed, because we get the introduction of Yuko, which is, Asa's friend at the beginning of the story, the girl with the glasses, the short hair. And we see that pretty much she's not everything that we are supposed to believe. At first glance, you just think she's a nice girl, nothing too crazy going on around her. But then you find out that she is actually secretly with a contract with the Justice Devil, at least early on in the story. That's where our interpretation of the Justice Devil is. And we see that pretty much she, one of the more iconic parts in part two, where you see both Yuko and Asa talking, and she's just like vibing, they have this nice little moment, and she just goes, hey, by the way, Asa, don't go to school tomorrow. And I was like, oh my God, what's about to go down? Like this is giving me, a school shooter vibes, from this girl. And that definitely is what was going to transpire, because in the next day, Yuko shows up in school, and it's a whole catastrophe that goes down. And this is where we see pretty much Asa, use her sword, her uniform sword, takes down, the Yuko, the Justice Devil, and all that. But she, we find out that she actually has like mutated herself to like look not like a human anymore because of the contract. So now she's in the running. And at first I was thinking, okay, she's going to be, just running, maybe she'll show up in the future. It was a nice little moment between Asa and herself and Yuko, where we see an interaction between these two characters, where I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, this is a character that might show up later on, if Asa needs help. This is a character that Fujimoto puts back in the back burner for a bit. They'll be reintroduced in the story later on. And oh boy, was I 100% wrong, because we see that she pretty much just leaves. The next couple panels is where we see a shadowy figure looking like Denji proceed to annihilate her, and proceeds to just like eat her. And at this point I was thinking, oh, this is going to be a great conflict. Maybe, Denji thought, oh, this is a devil that, is trying to kill people, and why not? I got to take it down. And, maybe that's what's the conflict. Once Asa finds out, oh, you killed my friend, fight you. Because there was a lot of setup regarding that. Like, oh, when is Asa going to find that out? And apparently, at least in my recollection of the story, she never does. So that was a big disappointment. I could be wrong. You guys can remind me in the comment section, like, oh, does she actually remember? I don't think she does, but I could be wrong. But continuing on, after that entire arc with the school, the next thing we catch up is pretty much back up with Denji. And this was a part in the story where a lot of the fans, the OGs of part one, were very ecstatic to see, and also very confused, because we see Denji kind of just walking around with no real purpose. And I like what Fujimoto was doing with Denji at first, in the beginning of the story, where we see Denji kind of be a husk. He's just kind of walking around, meandering, with no real dreams or intentions, because for the better or the worse, after the events of part one, yes, he gained Nayuta and the dogs and everything that he loves up to this point of the story, but he also lost, his dearest friends in both Aki and Power. So it was very interesting to see how Denji's, was trying to move on from the past trauma and, overcoming the loss of his, friends, his family. And I also like the dynamic with Yoshida and Denji at the beginning, where Yoshida's pretty much just his caretaker. He's kind of just looking around, making sure Denji doesn't step out of boundaries and he doesn't get in trouble. And I like all of that. I liked all of that, at least in the beginning. As the story continues, we see that Yoshida's character begins to diminish in its its mystique and slash well writtenness, I would say. But forgive me to be getting sidetracked. As we see all this going down, we eventually get the moment where both of our characters, the MC at least at the beginning of part 2, and Asa interacting with Denji, where they have this iconic moment where both of them are chilling, and we see that Asa Denji's just like, hey, I'm Chainsaw Man. And then she's like, you dumbass, like, no, you're not. And, she proceeds to just like not care about him. Like, she's just like, you're a weirdo, like, bye-bye. And I like all of this because he was like, that's something Denji would say just to impress a chick. And in reality, it really like turned her off, because we know that at the beginning of the story, Asa definitely hates Chainsaw Man. She definitely hates him because she finds him to be the reason that the Typhoon Devil, I had something in my throat. the Typhoon Devil, caused a ruckus that eventually led to Asa's mom being killed, in the whole Typhoon Devil incident. And, after that, she blames Chainsaw Man. She hates him. And she's like, oh, it was all your fault. You don't care about the casualties. And I like how Denji pretty much just openly says, yo, I'm Chainsaw Man. And she, does not care about it. She doesn't believe him whatsoever. And eventually that leads up to the aquarium arc, where we once again get reintroduced to the character of the Eternity Devil. And a little bit before that, and a thing that I thought was very interesting to note is that the first introduction of Denji as Chainsaw Man was where two people were going to die, and Denji just demolishes the cockroach devil and instead protects the cat. That was the first real return of Denji in the story, and that was a nice little context that later pays off, kinda, towards the end of the story that was set up early on, which I really appreciate. And I know a lot of fans like that first reintroduction to the story of Denji, so I just wanted to note it before I continue on. And pretty much what happens is they go to the aquarium, and a lot of people would say the aquarium arc it's a really good arc. Specifically, the reason why is because it sets up Denji and Asa's relationship going forward. It's one of those arcs where they're trapped, and Denji knows all about this because he already dealt with it once. And it was great seeing, Asa, trying to sound, very intelligent, and Denji just not caring about anything she said about the starfish facts and all that, which was hilarious. And it really showcased us, a lot of Asa's personality, really shine in this arc. And the thing I like the most about this is that, like I said, it was the small moments between both Asa and Denji where they're in the aquarium. You really get to see an understanding of these two characters being like really enjoying their presence with one another. And even Denji says at one point, like, you're a weird girl, but like, I kind of like that though. And it was very cute. It was very like, teenage kind of like love. It was very wholesome, very cute. And I adored it. I thought that was actually, I believe, if you can go track my channel, my playlist of the Chainsaw Man chapters, and I believe the first chapter I reviewed was that Denji and Asa in the aquarium chapter, because I thought it was great, and I was like, okay, I have to review part 2. And the rest is history. I reviewed the rest of it. But continuing on, this chapter I loved, and I would say is one of my favorite chapters in the story, not just in part 2, but in the entirety of Chainsaw Man, because I thought it was just a very nice chapter, seeing these two characters that really are loners for the most part, trying to, get trying to pretty much get to know one another in these crazy circumstances, and eventually befriend one another, and, which then leads up to a date, which is the next thing I want to talk about, because preceding this aquarium thing is that both Denji and Asa agreed to go on a date. And when it comes to this date, it was a crazy reading this week to week, because I remember specifically where pretty much Asa just Yoru proceeds to put Denji's her hand on top of Denji, being like, hey, turn into my sword. And everybody, I remember that cliffhanger was crazy. Everybody was like, oh my god, is Denji gonna die? Like, is my man gonna just like become a weapon? Oh my god, it's being foreshadowed. There's an illustration of Asa carrying a chainsaw for the promotion of part 2. Oh my god, it's gonna happen. And in typical Fujimoto fashion, it did not, but it definitely scared everybody. Instead, it subverted our expectations, because we have this great moment where then Denji proceeds to touch Asa's head, and he's just like, oh, Asa's spinal sword. And he's like, what was that? He's like, I don't know. That's a weird way to say goodbye to someone. Peace out. And I love this whole dynamic. And then you find the whole explanation is like, oh, well, Yoru has to make somebody feel like they own them before turning them into a weapon, and henceforth that's why she couldn't turn Denji, obviously. And pretty much after that, we catch up and we see that they do go on a date. Like, they're like, hey, you can come to my place, watch a movie, and why not? And as they do this is where we have one of the more scummy moments that Yoru does, where she takes over Asa's body and proceeds to kiss Denji. And I know a lot of people in the fandom really dislike this scene, but in the context of the story, it makes 100% sense why Yoru would do such a terrible thing. Like, Yoru wants to do these. She's a very like front and center person. She does not think. She just does things. She does them and then thinks later. And in this point in case, she was trying to make Denji like fall for her. Therefore, she could manipulate him. But it definitely did not work out, because as all this kissing is going down, the next thing we know is we get the reintroduction of the control devil, which is Nayuta, which is a fan favorite. At least she's a fan favorite for me as well. I love her character, specifically what they did from part 1 to part 2, and like how they, at first in part 1, you're just thinking, oh, Denji's gonna raise her up to be like a nice, gentle, like a kid. No, completely the opposite. She is a hot-headed teenager, and I loved it because it's very realistic. As somebody that had younger siblings, being the older one, that is definitely like the way Denji, is treating like Nayuta is very realistic to an older sibling, younger sibling relationship, which I thought it was hilarious. And we proceed to see just how powerful she is, because she's able to pretty much knock over Yoru and Asa and make them pretty much forget all about this date. And as all that transpires, then we get to see more info about Nayuta and how she's a spoiled brat, to say the least. She cares about Denji so much. She's like, oh, you gotta love me the most, typical, spoiled kid, right? And there's a nice little continuation of that, where eventually, as all this is going down, we get more information on pretty much what proceeds to be the main plot thread of the story, which is the introduction of Fami. Now, I didn't bring her up earlier on the story in the arc of Yuko, because I wanted to bring it up specifically here, which is the interaction of Fami talking to Yoru and pretty much making a plan to separate both Denjis, which happens later in the story, where we see that their plan is to separate the Black Chainsaw Man and the Red Chainsaw Man, because they know they're two different entities, which us as the viewers, we do know that as well, because Pochita is the Black Chainsaw Man, and then Denji taking over is the Red Chainsaw Man. So this is where Yoru, proceeds to just make this whole plan about, hey, we got to take over, let's have an alliance to defeat Denji. And while all that is transpiring, we in the background also find out that there is a fake Chainsaw Man, something that has already had been hinted at earlier in the story, which in my opinion, was one of the more interesting points in the story, where I was like, what's going on? What's this whole fake Chainsaw Man theory? And the fake Chainsaw Man is a character that pretty much gets introduced right around the whole Chainsaw Man Church arc, which in many people is a hit or miss arc. This is where a lot of people either fall off of the story, where they just say, hey, this was not for me, I did not like this, or people would say like, okay, this is where part 2 starts getting even better. I'm in the latter, where I think that part 2 with the Chainsaw Man Church was one of the most fascinating aspects of the story, because I like the idea of having this cult surrounding Chainsaw Man, and the idea of why they were doing that, and the introduction of the old hybrids, like Bareem, for example, which in my opinion, I think it's very easy to say he is definitely the most malicious villain in the story, at least in part 2. He really mirrors Makima to a T, and we do know that because he was obviously a Makima stan. Like, he 100% loved Makima, and we see that he's a very cold-hearted person, and I would say I hate him with every fiber of my body, and yet I still gotta admit he does an exceptional job as an antagonist. And his introduction, with Denji, it was already very uncomfortable. Seeing him interact with Denji, I knew something was off with this guy, and later on in the story we find out even more. And as the story proceeds, we also get an introduction to the old hybrids, and the old hybrids, in my opinion, in retrospect, I would say are the biggest misses in the entirety of part 2, because there was so much potential with these characters, yet nothing really of substance paid off. For example, some characters like Fugo, the sword hybrid, they get some setup, and you're thinking, oh, Fujimoto's gonna do something with them. Denji, he's talking about, oh, I don't have any friends. I thought you could be my friend, Denji, and nothing really pays off with that. And then there's the whip lady, and then the spear hybrid, and these characters are just very one-dimensional, very forgettable. and they all get dispatched like pretty easily, because we find out that they're gonna do like a terrorist attack, because of the Chainsaw Man Church, and they're actually stopped, thankfully, by Quan Chi. Quan Chi just like speed blitzes them all, and it was crazy seeing her like again. It was great seeing her again, and I loved it. I love seeing Quan Chi again, and also the reintroduction of Katana Man. Katana Man was another character that in part 1 I was like, okay, he's cool. Like he did a good job for the earlier arcs, right? But I'm just gonna say part 2 made me love Katana Man. I love this petty king. All right, he is such a petty king, and I love it. He is hilarious, and I love his interactions with both Denji and Asa, and how he actually gets some karma on Denji. When he eventually later on in the story proceeds to, give him a payback for what him and Aki did to him in the train station, which was hilarious. But before I go any further with any of that, as the story continues, we also see the dynamic of the public safety, where we get the introduction of other characters like, Fumiko and, Yoshida, you really putting his foot down and being like, Denji, listen, you need to stop being Chainsaw Man, because we find out around the earlier quarter of the story, if not like a third of the way into the story, about the prophecy, the Nostradamus prophecy, which pretty much becomes the final overarching theme in the story about how the Death Devil will show up, and once she shows up, everything will, succumb to exist, everybody will die, and why not? And this is the big thing. And I remember during this time in the story, reading it in a weekly basis, which I would say was phenomenal, but also very annoying, because every chapter, everybody would be like, oh, this person is a Death Devil, this person is a Death Devil, this person is and it became a meme. I love that. I remember at one point people were like, oh, it has to be Kobeni. Kobeni has like a contract with the Death Devil for sure. And I love all the, all the funny jinx that came up with the Death Devil theories and all that. And pretty much as the story continues, we eventually get the whole collapse of the Chainsaw Man Church, where we find out that it's pretty much like a terrorist thing. It gave me vibes of, if you guys seen the movie Fight Club or V for Vendetta, where all these explosions in buildings are happening simultaneously, because they were pretty much the whole point that we thought. Originally, we thought that the whole thing with the Chainsaw Man Church was, it was weakening the Chainsaw Man Devil in Denji, because less people were becoming afraid of him, and instead they were like, oh, they were worshiping him. In other words, nerfing Denji, right? But in reality, what they were trying to do is actually make the Chainsaw Man become be more fearful, because after this is where all the followers, making the contract with the Justice Devil, which later on we find out is actually the Fire Devil. This contract of them, becoming like Chainsaw Man hybrid kind of things, or not hybrids, but spawning chainsaws from their heads, and why not? And that leads to a whole, Yoru and Denji and the rest of the crew just slaughtering all these people. This is where we see the big payoff of them pretty much being like, no, this was all a setup, because we want to make the Chainsaw Man Devil more powerful. And why do they want to make him more powerful? Because they want him to get strong enough to stop the prophecy. At least that's for the interpretation that we're given at the beginning of this whole conflict. And as this goes on, then we find out that, Yoru is actually regaining her strength, because, she is also the conflicts in the world. People are going at war with each other. And this is where we also see the Denji eventually, as he gets pretty much taken over by the public safety, because the public safety is like, listen, Denji, either you can work with us or go against us. Nayuta, we obviously know that you care for her, but if you go against us, we will, we'll have to turn our back against you and, take you down. And Denji doesn't want to do anything that might danger Nayuta, which eventually, as Nayuta at one point even asks, like, what do you want to do? Do you want to be Chainsaw Man or do you want to be Denji? And Denji's like, I want to be Chainsaw Man. Because at this point he had a crossroads in his head where he's like, do I want to be famous? Do I not want to be famous? Because at the same time, Asa was getting some popularity and some notoriety, because she started joining the whole Chainsaw Man, fan group, where she became like one of the spokespersons for the Chainsaw Man Church. We're like, oh yeah, the Annihilation crew and all that. And people are starting giving her more attention, and in retrospect, she starts, really fronting on the fact that she's becoming famous, right? And there's a nice panel where you even see her like kind of like looking at the TV and people hyping her up, and she's like, yes. And this is where fame starts getting in her head, and she starts not thinking clearly. Or she starts to just blindly follow orders, similar to Denji in the public safety at the beginning of the story. And this where the whole conflict of, the Chainsaw Man Church actually betrays them, and it was a whole charade. And this where Bareem and the rest of those hybrids, they try to take him out. And eventually we do find out that, Denji gets taken out because the effects of both Asa and Yoru, because of them fighting Denji, they eventually do get like the Statue of Liberty to use as a weapon, and they blast, Denji, and Denji's proceeded to like be completely annihilated, right? And as all that it was happening, we see that Denji's body eventually does get captured by, the public safety people. I think it was a Soviet. I forget where they got. I think the public safety got his body, and they're keeping him hybrid because they do not want him to turn into Chainsaw Man. Because if Chainsaw Man eats the Death Devil, that would be like the whole thing with the prophecy, right? So they're trying to keep him in stasis, and this is where we see that Asa is trying to break him out. This is a whole break him out kind of mission, and it's her and Fami. They're both like, okay, well, let's do this. And as though this is going down, we eventually do see that they're gonna proceed to break Denji out. And as they do that, they stumble upon some machines, they take it out, and then they stumble upon Katana Man. And this, you're like, oh man, like they're in danger because Katana Man could defeat these two. Like they're not that powerful. At least at this point in the story, they're not. And before any of this, I also would be a fool to not bring up the fact that earlier in the story we got the introduction of the Falling Devil, which the Falling Devil was a great arc in my opinion. We're once again showing us the despair of both Denji and Asa, breaking, like trauma dumping upon them. And this arc happened early on, where we see the destruction of everything around, and this is where we get to see a big moment between Asa and Denji, where you see Denji and her like saving each other. It's like, what keeps you going? Like, and this where we see Asa being like, like Denji, what, like not Denji, but like Chainsaw Man, like, why do you do the things you do? Like, there's no meaning in life. It's like, oh, there is. It's like, well, what's the meaning of life? It's like, the meaning of life is that I do it because I want to have sex. And then Asa's like, ew. And I love that scene. And then eventually they don't defeat the Falling Devil, but the fake Chainsaw Man gets introduced once again in a shadowy figure. And then she's like, wait, what? And then he's like, go, Chainsaw Man, go, get out of here. And the Fallen Devil is taken care of, at least for the moment being. Because later on, they will come back, and we'll catch back up with them in a bit. But continuing on, like I was saying, they break out, they're trying to break out Denji, both Fami and Asa/Yoru. They stumble upon Katana Man. Katana Man is like giving them a hard time. And then Quan Chi proceeds to put a stop to it and being like, hey, get him out. Like, get Denji out. And Katana Man gets like speed blitzed by Quan Chi because Quan Chi is insanely powerful. And as all this is going down, they eventually do stumble upon Denji. And this were, they're like, oh, let's get out of here. So they get Denji, they break him out, which was a horror scene, seeing Denji's bodies being turned into pieces. And this is where Asa finally gets the realization, like, he's actually Chainsaw Man. Oh my God. Like, I'm not insane. And, everything kind of falls into place. They escape. Later on, as all this is going down, Quan Chi, she stays behind to let them escape. She takes the blame. She's kind of injured because she's running around, carrying everybody around. And all these public safety people are coming around, all these devils. And she's like, hey, get out of here. I'll protect you guys. Like, I'll make it seem like you guys took me down. Why not? And they're like, oh, okay, cool. So it was great seeing Quan Chi. I believe that's the last time we see her, where she's like kind of protecting Fumiko and the rest of the crew. Which, let's talk about Fumiko, because this is a character I know a lot of people want to hear my 2 cents about. I think Fumiko is a very wild character. Let's just say that. Because at the beginning of the story, her character is kind of all over the place. Let's just be honest. At the beginning of the story, we get introduced to her in the most crazy way possible, where she's trying to give Denji a handy, and is very like trying to seduce him. And then eventually she's trying to like make him do things that he doesn't want to do for her own pleasure. And then we find out that she's actually not even a teenager. She's like somebody that has been working under the public safety for a while, like a secret agent. And then we find out that she's like a fan of Chainsaw Man. She made this whole story where like, oh, actually Chainsaw Man's cool. I like him. But then while the whole fiasco of the Chainsaw Man Church went down, where the public safety is going after Denji, as well as the Chainsaw Man Church is going after him. And they're all in the run, as pretty much Nayuta, Denji, and Nayuta and Denji are running around for their own safety. this is where we see that she pretty much says, peace out, deuces, and she dips on them. Like, she kind of just turns her back on them when she was just like, I'll protect you, Chainsaw, and she proceeds to do the opposite. So, and then later on in the story, we get once again introduced to her. Like, her character is very weird, because like Fujimoto obviously had a big thing with her, like where he really liked bringing her up in the story, but like her character really didn't do anything for the most part, at least in my opinion, except for one thing later on in the story, which is kind of a plot twist, but I mean, it's whatever. But forget me for, being sidetracked. Let's continue on. We see going forward as Denji and Nayuta are running around, trying to go for their escape. They do get separated and once they do get separated, this is where we get a scene where Nayuta's like, hey, Denji, get away. I'll let you get away. Run. I'll fight them off. And this is where Barim is there. And then, Barim at this point, he's kind of bloody because both Denji and Nayuta have fought him. And this is the thing where Barim had also burned, Denji's place, where the cats and the dogs were there. And at that point, he became public enemy number one. Like, he was an unforgivable villain that he was just levels of Makima evilness. Definitely did not disappoint in that department. And continuing on, we see that that's where Denji gets separated from Nayuta, which then leads to obviously Asa and them breaking him out. And they're in the run. Asa, Denji, Katana Man, Yoru, Fami, and the guy from the the number one fan of the Chainsaw Man like fight club or whatever, he's there with them. I forget his name, but it was great. The guy that has like the little Chainsaw Man thing here. They're all running around. Eventually, they're hiding, and while they're hiding around, this is where we get one of the most controversial chapters in the story, which for a lot of people, this was a whole deal. This was a big deal for a lot of people. This is the chapter where we see eventually as they're running around, Denji and Asa, they're both kind of like tired. They're at this alley, and this is where Yoru proceeds to take over, Denji's Asa's body, and proceeds to give Denji starts kissing him, and then proceeds to give him a handy, to say the least, a hand. And I remember when this chapter came out, everybody in the internet was like, blowing their heads up. Like, everybody was like, oh, this is like ludicrous. This is like blasphemy. Fujimoto should be locked up. And I was like, bro, like, I don't think you guys realize, like, this is not even the worst thing Yoru has done. You guys are freaking out about over the fact that she took over Asa's body and made her do this, which, by the way, it is a very messed up thing to do. Let's just be honest. Like, this was like, I remember I felt so bad for Asa, dude. I felt so bad for Asa, because then later on she's like, oh, he's gonna think I'm a slut, because at this point we have developed the whole relationship with Asa and Yoru, where we do know that both Denji likes Asa, and Yoru and Asa in retrospect like Denji. So, as Yoru does, she does the typical not thinking and just does things. She gives him a hand, and Denji relieves himself. And this is like I said, a chapter that was very controversial for a lot of reasons. And all I'll say is that in the story, in the setting, and everything that was behind it, I think it made practically good sense why Yoru did the thing that she did. Is it justifiable? Absolutely not. I don't think what she did to Asa's body was any way in the right, but I do see why she would try to take the advantage of anything she could to make Denji fall for her, in a very a very straightforward version of trying to just seduce him, get him off and all that. So, continuing with the controversies, we see the next chapter. They are all eating, and it's very awkward. They're all like, "Oh man," like, because they go to a sushi place, and I was like, "Oh, I don't like shellfish and wine." And I was like, "I'll just eat rice or something." And this is where one of the most controversial chapters also happens, like literally back to back almost. Whereas they're in this restaurant, eventually Barim pulls up. Like, Barim out of nowhere is like, "Yeah, you guys thought I was dead, huh?" Then he's like, whoa, everybody's like, what's going on? And this is like, he's like, oh, you should stay. Like, here, I actually got more food. Like, and he opens the plate, and that's where we get the decapitated head of Nayuta. And this was a crazy chapter. I remember everybody in the fandom was coping. They're like, no, actually, Nayuta's mole is in the other face. You don't see her mole. People were theorizing, oh, it's actually a cake, like a cake head or something like that, just to mess with Denji. That was actually a good theory, I would say. That the whole, like, oh, he made a cake, that like a cake head that looked just like her. Because I was thinking to myself, like, oh, that's actually a good theory in retrospect. But knowing Fujimoto, I was like, no, I feel like she's dead. And sadly, yeah, it was obviously her. And then this is what ends up leading to the events of Denji losing his cool and becoming the full Chainsaw Man once again, and proceeds to obliterate, Bareem once again. Just obliterates him like nothing. And as this goes on, we see that Denji's kind of just, fighting everything. He's going everywhere. He's going, like, the public safety's trying to take him out, and they're all getting, like, destroyed. All these, like, public safety people with, like, contracts, they're all getting devoured. Like, the note, like, I believe it was the ear devil, and all this is transpiring at this point. He's just eating them all, eating these concepts out of existence left and right, which then Yoshida tries to fight it. And then, Yoshida's, like, devil, like, he holds Denji, and then he, like the Pochita, and then he makes him spit out, like, like the ears and the mouths and stuff, but he's not able to defeat him. He just gets cut off, and he runs away. And because at this point in the story also, as Asa was in her place, you also see a whole thing where Yoshida was trying to fight Yoru, because he thinks of her as a threat now after the whole Chainsaw Man fiasco went down, and she has to be exterminated. And this is where we see that Yoru has, increased her power, like where she makes a whole room sword, and then eventually her power, as the story progresses going forward from this point, her power just keeps increasing drastically more and more and more, to the point where we leave up to this fight where we see Asa, Yoru fighting, or should I say more Yoru, eventually fighting, the Chainsaw Man in Pochita. And this is the fight that, precedes everything, and eventually obliterates Denji with like a big, like the Statue of Liberty sniper thing. And pretty much after that, this is things get really, really crazy, to say the least, because as all this is going down, we also see that, we find more about Yoru in the sense that she was the mother of both, apparently, of the nuclear and the tank devils or something like that, because she's like, come to me, my kids. And then she proceeds to bring back, like in her gloves, the tank and the nuclear bombs. And this is where we start developing just how powerful Yoru is, especially towards the end of the story, where we find out that she's actually seems to be taking over the world for the most part, where her power has become insanely out of Pochita's power scaling, I would say. But that's not all. We also get the revelation in April Fool's, if I remember correctly, of last year, is the whole big revelation of the identity of both the fake Chainsaw Man as well as the real Death Devil, which all along we had thought it was Fami. She kept calling herself the Famine Devil and why not. But in reality, she was playing us all for fools, because she was actually the Death Devil all along, which I would go as far as to say was one of the craziest plot twists in the entire story. I would say up there as well with the plot twist of Makima being the Control Devil. I knew there was something with Makima and why not, but I was not expecting her to be the Control Devil and this powerful entity that was, the four horsewomen and why not in part one. So the reveal of, Fami being the Death Devil all along was a crazy reveal. And because we also get introduced, because it's kind of like it's a fake notion that Fujimoto's setting up, because in that same chapter we get introduced to a new character, and she's doing the whole thing like grabbing somebody by the head and trying to transform them, and we're thinking to ourselves like, oh, she's gonna kill them, like she's the Death Devil and all that, because she keeps bringing up death. But in reality, she is actually the Famine Devil, because that one, she's like, wait, what are you doing here, like, and he's like, wait, you're the Famine Devil, who's that then? And this is, like I said, she's the Death Devil, and we see her, and she was actually all along, holding her true identity, and we see how powerful she is, as well as we see the inside of her, which is empty and hollow, because she's been eating herself, because she's trying to like kill herself, but she can't. So as all this is transpiring, a lot of developments are going on in the story that at this point in the story, I was thinking to myself like, yo, this is very, like, I'm locked in. I'm locked the F in when it comes to this point in the story. I'm like, well, this is very fascinating. The prophecy is about to happen. The Death Devil finally made her move. What's going to transpire? And as all that was going down, we also get, Yoru becoming insanely powerful because of the conflicts of the world happening. The eventually causes, war, like the U.S. to create nuclear bombs because they bombed I forget which country, but they bombed somebody. And because of that, nuclear bombs came back to the existence, which in retrospect, Yoru was able to obtain that power. And because of that, she ended up being extremely powerful. And then she's like, thank you, America. Or like, I love America. Which I love that panel with her like this. And this is where we get her cape, everything like the aura, where she's just like, yes, my devils come and rule the world because we shall make it like a world full of war. And pretty much going forward from here, the story starts losing some steam, I would say. And most people agree with it because this is where Denji, he eventually, we get a reintroduction of the Sword Devil because apparently he's still with, Little D, because we find out that, that's her actual name, Little D. And she tells Denji, like, hey, help me out. And Denji's like, oh, he's still thinking of Fumiko, which, by the way, Fumiko shows up like in his room and gives her like a naked picture of herself. She's like, hey, shh, like, think of this. And once again, Fumiko is a wild character in this story, and she is the most character of all time. Like, she's just there. She serves a purpose, kind of, and I'll get to it towards the end. But yeah, just crazy stuff. And talking about crazy stuff, let's talk about when Yoshida, Asa, and Denji all got trapped in the Agent Devil, where all they got sucked in. Because the Agent Devil, during the fight of Asa and Denji, where you're thinking like, oh, Denji's gonna be destroyed, the Agent Devil actually like sucks them all in, and this is where we're all trapped in the world of the Agent Devil. And the Agent Devil was kind of broken. Like, I ain't gonna lie, like when they all got trapped in, I was like, how are they gonna stop him? And this is where we find out more politics about how like the higher ups in Japan, they actually want to use the Agent Devil to make themselves like immortal. Like, they want Denji to eat the Agent Devil so nobody can die from aging and be eternally, young or not age generally, which then asks a lot of questions in my mind where I'm thinking, okay, so how does that work? If you're a baby, do you never age? Like, it was a lot of questions brought up at that point. But we never really we don't really get that play out because obviously Denji and Asa take care of it. They defeat the devil and they get out, which was a crazy way to defeat him, because they're like, okay, well, I can spit them out, because Denji eventually spits out Yoru and Yoshida. But they're like, okay, well, I'm going to be stuck here with you. And then he's like, so what? You think you're going to be stuck with me forever? You think you're going to, like, that's a win for you? And then Denji's like, no, you don't get it. Like, either two ways. You can either make a contract with me to get me out of here and I'll never come back, or you can stay with me for eternity. It's your choice. And then, as easy as she could make the decision, she just kicks him out, because she was not going to put up with Denji's idiocracy for anymore. Like, she was just like, this guy's an idiot, and she hated him. So she kicks him out, and she promised like never fight them again. And, she goes on her way. She dips. And this, like I said, later on in the story, the final act of the story plays out where we see, Yoru gaining her forces and her devils and all that, trying to fight Denji. And this is also where we see, I would say, one of the more crazy chapters, where we see the eventual demise of Yoshida. And how that plays out is because apparently, remember, Denji is in, hiding with Little D and the Sword Devil, the Sword Hybrid and whatnot, and they're all hiding away. And Yoshida pays Denji a visit. He buys him a pizza. They're talking, and they're like, hey, doesn't this reminisce of stuff? He's like, yeah, I guess. He's like, but Denji was like, I don't want to turn into Chainsaw Man again. And, Yoshida's like, oh, listen, like, I'm here to make my purpose. And he's like, it's like, I had a good time, Denji. I had fun. Like, you were a good friend. And then she's like, okay, man, like, well, best for luck for you too, I guess. And I remember reading this chapter and I was like, something's off. Like, this is not, normal. Like, something's off with Yoshida. And we find out Yoshida's whole purpose, which is a tragic purpose, was for him to eventually make Denji transform into the Chainsaw Man once again. And that's what transpires, because apparently after all that, we see that Denji, as Yoshida pretty much nukes herself. He nukes himself. He explodes. Vareem once again shows up, and he just, pulls out his flamethrower and starts burning Yoshida's like remain corpse and whatnot. And this is what sets up Denji to just completely lose it. It's like, all right, screw this guy, I'm gonna eat him. And he proceeds to eat Vareem. Finally, eliminate that bozo, take him out of here. He sucked. He always sucked. But this is where Denji, as Pochita, takes over. And this is where, like I said, we kickstart the final confrontation of the story. And this is where I would say, once Denji was with Pochita, was fully awakened with Little D, as well as the Sword Hybrid and the Famine Devil, when all of them were fighting Yoru, this is where, in retrospect, I can say the story definitely took a nosedive, at least from a storytelling perspective. And my biggest complaint would be that after this is where the chapters week to week just became, like, in my opinion, just a bunch of action, like just action that was really no real depth into the characters. It was just a bunch of action, and it became very repetitive. It became like, oh, Asa got a new power. She's gonna defeat Denji. Oh, Denji maneuvered a way out of this. Oh, Denji then fought it, and then so forward and so forth. And as all that played out, we see that pretty much that's what happens. Towards the end of the story, this is where we see that Denji and proceeds to eat the Death Devil and the Famine Devil and the Sword Hybrid, and Pochita proceeds to just have an eternal duel with Yoru. And I remember reading these chapters and just thinking to myself, like, yeah, this is cool. Like, I like the whole, like, oh, Michigan sword and all this. Like, this is very fascinating. But I'm thinking to myself, okay, this has to build up to something crazy. Like, and I'm sad to say this, but it really doesn't for the most part, if not anything. Because as we see throughout the chapters, yeah, a lot of cool stuff happens. We get Denji, becoming one like new entity called like the Denji Chainsaw Man, which is like Denji being full control of Pochita, like in his full power version. So henceforth, there's a point where like Yoru defeats Chainsaw Man, Pochita, and she's about to turn him into a weapon, but then Denji's like, rock, paper, scissors, and like, she's going like this, is like scissors, so he defeats her, which was a very brilliant way of Fujimoto to walking around the whole, Denji being turned into a weapon by Yoru. So mad props for him for him in that regard. But as the fight continued on and on and on and on, this is where we get the introduction of a lot of people's most controversial aspect of the story, the Locust Devil. When they go to hell, Denji goes to hell, and in retrospect, it kind of makes sense. Where once they go, there's a whole thing where they go to hell, and as Denji goes there, it's empty. There's no devils there. There's just a vast of emptiness. And I remember when they went to hell, I was thinking, okay, this is the perfect moment for Denji to find, the Blood Devil. This is the whole thing. There has to be some payoff to that, right? Power said, yo, find me, this and that, try to befriend the new Blood Devil and all that. And sadly, none of that happens. If anything, Denji goes in there and he fights Yoru, and then eventually the Locust Devil shows up, and the Locust Devil gives him a hard time. Eventually, Denji takes him out through the efforts of both Yoru and him fighting it to defeat it. And as all that is happening, we get really, once they come back to Earth, this is where we get the payoff, I guess, of finding out more about Fumiko. And the big payoff is apparently anytime there was narration in the story, Fumiko was the one narrating. At least that was my interpretation of what was transpiring. Where we see that Fumiko, obviously, she's talking in her different new Fumikos, but because we also find out later on in the story that Fumiko has a contract with the SCD Devil. Yeah, you heard that right. So she's able to transmit herself into different Fumikos and all that. Like anybody, if I remember correctly, anybody that has had sex with Fumiko Fumiko can then make them a new Fumiko, and henceforward, and they all share like collective consciousness kind of thing. Crazy stuff. I was like, whoa, Fujimoto, you're wild for creating the STD Devil. But it's canon. But we see that Fumiko's freaking out. She's like, oh, this is Fumiko from this part of the world, and they're all getting eaten because as the devil got destroyed and nobody's dying anymore, that meant that insects, by process of elimination, no longer, like, that never happened anymore. So now insects would just eternally spawn in. There was no more like, oh, for every 100 insects, maybe like 20 of them are birth. No, all of them would be. And then it became the mass hysteria where everybody was afraid of insects, and henceforward it created new entities of insects, and they're the most powerful things in the verse apparently. Because as all this is happening, this is where Asa and Yoru, they're like, hey, Denji, we gotta call a truce because we gotta fight these things. But before any of that, this is where, as Asa takes over, Yoru, she's able to take over her body once again. We get a great flashback of Asa's pretty much character, and we get more of her backstory and her lore about her mom. We get to find out just how horrible a person her mom was, and why Asa has so much trauma. Because we find out about Asa's mom killing her dad, because apparently to her dad was a cheater and he deserved to die, but keep the shush. And Asa had to keep that hidden for the rest of her life, knowing that her mom was the reason her dad died, which was crazy. And then she was like, oh, it's actually like his fault for me killing him. And all this crazy stuff. And this very similar to Denji killing his dad. And this where we see a big emotional moment with Denji and Asa talking to each other in this mental state dream sequence, which was very wholesome. I would say it was one of my favorite chapters in the story as well. The interaction of Asa and Kid Denji talking to each other, being like, hey, you can lift up yourself. Like, that I know things are horrible, but I'll show you a good world. Awesome. And this really set up their dynamic, their relationship. Maybe like, okay, both of us have a lot of suffering. We come from a tragic past, but, through one another, we can show each other, what true happiness means. And, what, we'll make one another happy. That's all we need in life. I thought that was the message that the story was going to go forward. And it's not even like, oh, I shipped them and all that, which I did, right? I ain't gonna lie, I did ship them. But it's not even so much of a thing like, oh, I shipped them, so they got to band together. It's more like, thematically, that's what the story was leaning towards, at least in my opinion, where it was going to be something along the lines like, maybe Denji was going to throw away, the Chainsaw Man in return, to protect Asa if Yoru were to die, give like a life for a life, like maybe Denji being like, I'll erase, I'll give away my Pochita's heart and I'll give it to you or something like that. I thought that was going to be like the final conclusion of the story. But as we find out later on, that is not the case. Instead, we see as Denji and Yoru are preparing to fight this devil proceeds to one-shot Denji, because Denji then wakes up and it's like, in this dream sequence where Pochita's talking to him, it's like, hey, we got eaten by a devil. And I remember reading this chapter when it came out. I was like, what's going on? Like, what? Am I missing something? Like, this random Hollow Knight villain showed up. The Hollow Knight defeated the Chainsaw Man. And in all honesty, this chapter, I'm not going to say it was not a good chapter. It was actually a very solid emotional chapter. Pochita's, saying goodbye to Denji and erasing himself from existence in the hopes of making all of this go away, because he knew all along that Denji, had always made wrong decisions. He actually prefer, suffering and why not. So he was like, I'm going to show you a life that, you're more comfortable with, which in retrospect is also a thing that I want to bring up earlier on in the story, where the Fire Devil, once we do find out that Justice Devil is the Fire Devil, the Fire Devil told Denji something very interesting, which is like, you will have to make a choice, because you kill these two twins that I actually was very fond of, and you could have rescued both of them, but instead you let them die. So I hate you, Chainsaw Man. And one of them wanted to become a Chainsaw Man, so I hate you for the fact that you got them both killed. But I will tell you this: there'll come a day where you have to make a choice, and you'll have two things to choose, and you can only choose one. So when that day happens, you'll better make the right choice. And at this point in the story, when Pochita, is doing all of this, it starts clicking in my mind like, well, what was the point of that? Because Denji didn't really make a choice. Denji didn't have no choice at all, because Pochita made the choice. Pochita was the one that made the choice to erase himself from existence, that in retrospect made it so none of the events of part 1 and part 2 ever transpire. Which, let's talk about the finale. That's what I want to end it on. The finale of the story, in my opinion, is utter garbage. I'm just going to say it out loud. I think it's a very lazy and very garbage-filled ending. And I know some people might be like, oh, you're not looking at the bigger themes of the story and all that. No, I am, but I just think it's a lazy ending. Like, it is what it is, guys. Come on, it's the last chapter. Now, I'm not saying that, maybe Fujimoto had like 2 or 3 more chapters to really develop these themes and, story elements that he was trying to hype up for the last chapter. Then it could have worked, I think. But it's just the fact that in the last chapter, you're throwing all of this at, like, it's like 200 miles per hour that you're throwing this at us. It doesn't, we cannot comprehend. It's not computing with all of us, because it just comes out of nowhere. There was no build up to this. It just suddenly happens. And the most frustrating thing about it all is that Fujimoto retcons what Pochita's power really is. Because let's talk about it. Pochita's power up to this point, anytime he erased a concept from existence, he made it so we, as the people living in this world, forgot about said concept. However, it did not make it so this concept never existed, period. And what I mean by that is this. When Denji ate the Mouth Devil, right? Mouth ceased from existence, people couldn't talk and all that. But it did not make it so, okay, now everything, like, it didn't rewrite history, so, I couldn't talk, so I couldn't become a singer or something like that. It didn't rewrite it in that regard. Like, no, like, the present was still transpiring as it was, right? similar to when he ate the ear devil. Like the ears were eaten, but you could still hear. Like it was not so much like, oh, you don't have ears anymore, so you can't hear. No, it was that you don't physically have ears, but the concept of hearing is still out there. So it was more of like noise was still out there. It wasn't like noise got erased because hearing, like because ears were eliminated. It didn't rewrite history. It made it so all entities would forget about such thing. Like pictures would be gone of such thing, but it wouldn't make it so history would be rewritten. You know what I mean? At least in the present time. It doesn't drag you back into the past is what I'm trying to get at. But that's what happens to transpire in this final chapter, which makes no sense. Which we see pretty much Denji in his shack. Eventually, the events transpire where he's going to meet with the grandpa, the Katana Man's grandpa. The whole zombie devil thing goes down. But instead of meeting Pochita, he meets Power. And it was just 100% pandering. And I hated every single page going forward from here. Where we see pretty much Power just shows up and saves the day. And then makes a contract with Denji. And like, all of this is like super superficial. Like, oh, everything just happened to land perfectly, with everything. Where we see that, Power saves the day. Denji doesn't die, as he should have if he was there. And then we pretty much proceed to see Nayuta come back to the story, which is another, like, what? Because if Chainsaw Man never existed, then how would Makima be killed by Chainsaw Man and then be reborn or eaten by Denji, which then she would be reborn into Nayuta? Like, none of that really makes sense. And another thing that doesn't make sense at all, which I will say at least they hinted at it, is that Pochita is not the chainsaw. He's not really the Chainsaw Man devil. He's something else. Because in this new timeline, that when time gets reset, chainsaws are still a concept. So Pochita was not ever the Chainsaw Man. Like, he was never the Chainsaw Devil. We don't even know what his devil was, which leaves a lot of room for a part 3 potentially in the future, which I guess it could happen, but the way it ends, it's very like, no, that's it, guys. You got your happy ending. Let it play out. Because in this ending that nobody ever met the Chainsaw Man, like, obviously Nayuta's alive, I guess. Doesn't really explain why. If anything, I think I would have less criticisms if at least Makima was around. You know what I mean? If Makima was still alive, because that would make more sense than Nayuta being alive. You guys can try to explain down in the comment section below, like, how that makes sense. Because for me, it makes absolutely zero sense. But as we see is that, Power, Denji, they're in this public safety, they're teaming up, and they eventually go kill Asa's teacher that becomes like the devil, the guy that was like trying to hook up with a student, or he was hooking up with a student, like that weirdo. They eliminate that, that devil, and then eventually we see Asa's about to fall. And this is a thing that I will say about the final chapter. I like the idea or the theme, right, of Denji, the symbolism, he threw away the chainsaw and to save Asa, right? That was his choice. He gave away Chainsaw Man to become that. But it really wasn't his choice, because Pochita made the choice for him. That's my biggest issue. As well as the fact that this Denji that we're introduced in the final chapter is not our Denji. That Denji we got, 232 chapters of development with. None of that has transpired with him. He has gotten no development. He is just the same Denji from Part 1. Is he less horny? I guess. Yeah, that's cool. But like, he has not learned any lessons. Like, he's just a dude. And I'm not really invested with that at all. And another moment that, in retrospect, it's a cool moment, but in reality is more like a meme, is the moment where both Denji and Asa reunite once again. And, it's Denji hugging her and, he saves her. She goes, "Oh, thank you, Chainsaw Man." And then you see Denji's heart like bump. And this, you can make an argument like, okay, at this very moment, did it make it so Pochita's heart is the concept of the Chainsaw Man devil came back to the world, similar to Yoru, where it was like very weak at first because the war devil was eaten by Denji, or he took a bite of her, so her powers were very, very weak. Is something along those lines like, oh, you're hinting at part 3 where Pochita's still there, within Denji's heart? Or is it more like a symbolism like, oh, Pochita will live on kind of in Denji and his thoughts or whatever, in a superficial way? And we see pretty much just being like, oh, thank you, Chainsaw Man. And then you see Denji being like, oh, what you say that? It's like, because you have a Chainsaw Man and you are a dude, like a man. And he's like, oh, yeah, right. And just for the record, I love all the memes that have come off of that panel. I think they're all hilarious. They're all very funny. If you guys haven't looked at them, just type in like "thank you Chainsaw Man" meme, and they're all hilarious, man. Like, I love the internet for that. And how the final panel was just pretty much, Denji looking at Asa, proceeding to just go back to being a regular student. Obviously, never meeting Yoru. Just become having a normal life, and then Denji just proceeds to go with power, right to the sunset, and being like, "Yep, let's continue living our lives." And that's how Chainsaw Man Part 2 ends. And to be honest, it was utter garbage, in my opinion. And this pains me so much because Chainsaw Man is one of my favorite stories of all time. And I loved it so much. I read all of Part 1 in within 2 days. And then, I believe Part 2 hadn't came out yet. And I think 2 months later, Goodbye Eri came out. Read it all, loved it. Read Look Back, loved it. And I was like, this Fujimoto guy is a goat. And then Part 2 came out, read it, weekly. And like I said, I loved it up to a certain point. And then that's when I started being like, and you can even see my reviews where I was like, yeah, this is good, but I don't know what Fujimoto's going to do, but let him cook. And oh my goodness, was I wrong about letting my man cook, because he did not cook us anything at the end. But yeah, my biggest problems with the story, I will say now in retrospect, now that we've seen the collectiveness of the Part 1, in this essay, I would say the biggest downfall of Part 2 would be Fujimoto himself. And what I mean by that is this: at least in my opinion, at certain points in the story, you see Fujimoto become overzealous. He becomes too obsessed with introducing all these new themes and all these new ideas that they become too much. It becomes a clusterfuck. There's just too many things that he's trying to blend in, and is not working. There's too many elements, like I said, like the hybrids, for example, bringing them all back. Cool idea in theory, but they don't really serve a real purpose, right? Besides having fan service in the sense of, oh yeah, Quan Chi's back, that's cool, but did she really play a real significant factor in the story? Not really. Katana Man, listen, I love my man Katana Man in Part 2, right? He actually is one of my fan favorites in Part 2. But did his character coming back serve a real purpose to the plot? Not really. It could have been anybody. So in retrospect, looking at the hybrids, yeah, it's cool that they came back, but none of them serve a real purpose, except for the exception of Bareem. Bareem was, listen, that dude was something else, man. He's in a whole other level of villainy. That dude he's a monster, and I loved him for that. I thought he was a great, villain. And I would even go as to say that he, in my opinion, in retrospect, he was my favorite villain in the story, thus far. Because Yoru, in my opinion, had the most potential in the entirety of the story to become something great. And the way that Fujimoto just puts her character to a stop, to a hauling stop, is very insulting, and I hate it. Yoru is one of those characters that, in my opinion, could have gone up there with one of the greatest villains of all time, one of the more fleshed out, best written characters, if she was done well. If her character had a good conclusion, she could have been up there with characters like Johann Lieber, Griffith, just characters of that caliber, where you're just man, these characters are great villains. But in retrospect, she, towards the end of the story, she was kind of a dud. She got all this power, but her character arc with Asa kind of just ends. It ends kind of abruptly. There's no real payoff. The biggest payoff you had is pretty much just Yoru telling Asa hey, you have all this guilt to yourself, but you shouldn't have any guilt, because we devils, we sympathize with humans whenever they feel bad about something, but you shouldn't even be feeling bad about anything, period, because these are normal things. I thought that was a nice moment, Yoru telling this to Asa, but it was not this is the final conclusion between these two characters. I think there should have been more. Perhaps maybe a moment where, Yoru has to make a decision okay, either save myself or Asa, and, she finally figures it out, maybe, I'll protect Asa, because I've done so many wrongs to her, and maybe Yoru has a big change of heart. Maybe she just thinks to herself oh, actually Denji has changed me, Asa has changed me, like maybe I am an idiot, maybe I'm a monster, but like that's all I know, but like I could do this final good deed or something like that. Because her character just kind of goes to the wayside towards the end of the story, which is a shame because Yoru and Asa's character was one of the most iconic things about part 2, especially because it was new, and like I said, Asa, I think as a character is phenomenally well written for at least to a certain point in the story, because towards the later like half of the story she's kind of like absent from it, it just becomes the Yoru show. And I like the Yoru show, right? It's fun. When she took over and she's telling Denji like, oh, I'll let you smash if you do this for me and that. It's great seeing her manipulate Denji. It's not great seeing it, but I'm saying like it makes sense as a villain, doing these tactics and why not. But seeing Asa take a back seat on all that, just kind of, I don't know, kind of like it puts a real sour taste in my mouth, especially how her character ends, where yeah, she has, I guess, a happy ending, right? Like, she still has her mom, maybe, like, I guess very ambiguous. She gets to be like a teenager, but she's still like a loner, she really doesn't have any friends. So it's kind of like bittersweet in that regard, but it's also like just garbage because once again, the Asa we get introduced at the end of the story is not the same Asa that has gotten all that development, that self-worth development where she's like, oh, I'm worth, she finds her own self-worth, which is very uplifting and very like, it's a very emotional whole arc that she goes on where she starts reflecting on herself, being like, you know what, I do deserve to live. Like, I am worth something. And I thought that was actually one of the best written parts in the story, where it was the moments where Asa was starting to, get out of her shell, starting realizing like, I should stop being so judgmental about myself and others. Like maybe I'm a terrible person. Maybe I got to change myself a bit and for the better. Like, or maybe, I've been too egotistical on my own behalf, like thinking like, oh, I'm better than everybody. Like, her learning these things, was some of the best written stuff in the story. But now coming to the end where we have a reset, it just goes to waste in my opinion. And I think like her character, in my opinion, in part 2 is the one, her and Yoru are the two characters that get done dirty the most. Like, and it's not even like a competition. Like, I think these two are the ones that get just thrown away alongside, Little D. Like the Death Devil, her character gets done so dirty, man. Like she had also a lot of potential as a final quote unquote villain if the story was constructed in a certain way. There was a lot of interesting things where we see that she actually is like, oh, I actually want to live because I made friends and all that. I love that whole aspect of it, or how she actually started, the Death Devil started becoming friends with humans, and she met all these regular high school kids, and just, I was like, oh, I gotta go to the school dance, I gotta help out with the school festival and all this. I thought that was very sweet. I like all of that, and it seems that towards the end of the story there was no real character for her besides something like superficial, like, oh, she's nice to humans, like that's cool. But the whole prophecy thing, I think it was hyped up to the point where we're all thinking, oh, it's gonna be something epic, and in reality it really wasn't. I guess it was in the sense like, if you want to see a lot of cool action scenes when the anime eventually animates this many years from now, yeah, it'll be awesome seeing like Yoru fight Denji, for over and over, like for episodes and stuff. But like, there's no real substance, at least from a character written aspect of it. And that's my thing that, like I said, I also started disliking a lot about Chainsaw Man towards the later half, is that, it became more substance over style, or more style over substance. Like it was like, yeah, there's a lot of cool fights and I love the illustrations and all that. But where's the real, like the meat of potatoes of what, in my opinion, makes Chainsaw Man so great, which is the character moments, the character growth, the development. It just started kind of taking more of a back foot, like, started becoming more of a back foot thing, and, taking more, not taking the front and center. It just became more of action sequences and less character moments, which I honestly started disliking a lot. I still was enjoying it, but I was thinking to myself, like, this could be better. And looking back at the way that it ends, man, it's really a shame, man. Like the way this all went to shit, to put it in simplest terms. Yoshida's character is another character that I think at the beginning of the story, I think he was a fan favorite. I know a lot of people when he died we were like, oh my god, like, and it was a very emotional moment, right, when he dies. But to that point in the story, he had been like absent, and like his character kind of started becoming a meme. Like especially when Nayuta and Denji were like stepping all over him, like in his authority. He started losing like some of his like, some of his aura, to say the least, right? He just became like another side character. It wasn't like, oh, what's he up to? Because at first, you guys remember, at first in part 2, he's very smart. He seems to be in cahoots with, Fami. And obviously, and later on, we do find out about that him and Little D have been have a thing working with one another. But there was not much of a payoff with him. It is very tragic that he dies. He was still a teenager, right? He was just, he was given a bad hand, at a young age. And, he obviously died a tragic way. I will say that. But I just wanted more with his character. And that's, I think, that the overarching thing about this ending and all of part 2 in general. I think I can speak for everybody that when I say that we wanted more out of the characters. And talking about more about the characters, let's talk about one of the more controversial things to happen in part 2, which was, I brought up the hybrids earlier, the reintroduction of all of them, right? I think the most controversial thing in part 2 in retrospect would be that not bringing Reze back at all. Not even for like a small little arc, nothing like that. I think that's such a wasted potential. And I think the reason that Fujimoto never reintroduced her is because he didn't have a proper way to do so. I don't think it's so much that it didn't fit the plot, because I think her coming back to the plot, it definitely would have made sense, whether to aid Denji or to fight for in behalf of someone else, whatever the case, her coming back and either helping Denji or, meeting Asa, which would have been a great interaction, meeting the girl, the new girlfriend, right? The new girl in the blog versus the ex. That would have been a fun little, back and forward, like Reze being like, oh, dude, so you're seeing someone else, Denji? How's that? And then Denji being like, well, it would have been a good soap opera, but I think that Fujimoto didn't want to do that, obviously. But to not have Reze show up, except for like a flashback scene, which it was like literally one panel, I think like it really puts a sour taste in my mouth, knowing that, okay, we got so much with the freaking sword hybrid. The sword hybrid, bro. Like, I don't care about this guy. I didn't care about any of those 3 bums. The only one that was cool that got reintroduced was Bareem. That's the only one of the hybrids that I was like, okay, this is cool. The other ones I could care less about. But yeah, Reze not being brought back to the story, I think that's a big L. Kishibe, where was he at? My man is in the public safety, and he's like the strongest hunter. Where was he at during this entire fight? Did he quit the public safety? There's not even a mention of him at all, right? I would think, oh, he's going to try to help Denji out. My man is not even in the story. Like, what's going on? In part 1, you obviously had your bunker and you saved Denji and all that. Where are you at now? So that's a big, like, what the hell? Like, where's he at? Like, and Kobeni, that's more like, okay, it would have been cool seeing her, just to get some closure. What's her devil? Because we don't even find out what her devil is. That's another unanswered question. We do see her brother, apparently Kobeni's brother. That was fun. But I wish we would have seen like Kobeni show up and like, imagine if she actually went to the aquarium to save her brother or something like that. That would have been cool. And maybe she explains like, oh, my devil is this, while fighting the Eternity Devil or something. But that's just wishful thinking. Like I said, I'm just telling you guys what I think were some of the big mistakes in the story, in my opinion. What are some things that I definitely did not like at all. And like I said, Kobeni, there's like a whole list. Kobeni not being even brought back for like a one panel or something, like a gag, was kind of a disappointment. Kishibe not showing up, I don't even think that's a disappointment. That's just a big like what the hell? Like, that's just like, dude, what are you doing? Like, why didn't you bring Kishibe back? He is in the public. All these public safety people are doing some scummy stuff. Where is he at? Like, my man would not be doing all of that. So him not being there, big L. Fumiko and Yoshida's characters, I think they could have been done better. Specifically Fumiko, I feel like she was just like a wild card. Like, and honestly, she, like, in my opinion, she did not serve any purpose in the story. I think Fujimoto just like writing her because like it was very wild. Every time she showed up, it was something wild that she was gonna do. Plus she was kind of hot. I ain't gonna lie. But yeah, I'm thinking like, the hybrids. like that's cool they showed up again, but like except for Bareem, they're all kind of like whatever, I don't care. Except for Bareem and Katana Man. Katana Man does get some good moments, all right? I won't give anybody no Katana Man slander. Because my man Katana Man listen, he gets a lot of fun moments, all right? I really like that. But Quan Chi, like I said, she shows up, it's kind of cool, but like really doesn't pay off at all. Like there's no real payoff to her character. Like I said, Asa, Yoru, that was such a waste. The four horsewomen being like a big essential part of the story. So much potential, but I think in retrospect, the landing did not land the way that Fujimoto was expecting it to land. But yeah, part 2 in a nutshell, if I had to rank it as a whole, like I think part 1 is at least a 9. Part 1 of Chainsaw Man, I think it's easily a 9. I think part 2 as a standalone story, I think you can maybe argue with this ending, like maybe a 6. It's because the ending, without this ending, I would have given it like maybe like an 8. Yeah, like an 8, like a low 8 or something. Because like I said, part 1, I love that story. I think it's like a 9, high 9, or low, like a high 9, high mid to 9. And part 2, I just think it's if the ending was better, if the ending landing, in my opinion, it probably would have been an 8, and then maybe in total Chainsaw Man as a whole would have been, if the ending was like it actually landed, if it landed to me, it would have been maybe like a 9 overall. But now after this ending, I would think I would drag all of Chainsaw Man as a whole maybe like to like a 7, and that's being generous because I don't see myself ever wanting to reread this. I reread it for the purpose of this video, but like from chapter 90 something or part 2 to this, I reread all part 2, but I didn't reread part 1 because I reread part 1 so many times, so I already know all there is to know about part 1. But in retrospect, reading it from, if I were to read it from part 1 to part 2, it just would feel like a waste of time. And I know many people might be like, oh, well, it's all subjective, and yeah, it is subjective. I ain't gonna lie, I'm not gonna like try to put a whole argument about it. It is subjective. People might think it's like amazing, but to me, in my honest opinion, I want to break down why I think it doesn't work. And the main issue that it does not work for me is that at no point Denji made any choices. Like he didn't make the choice to, Pochita, stop doing this because I'm doing this self-destructive behavior. Pochita took that upon himself. So Denji never really learns anything, right? And listen, in my ideal ending, it would have been something along the lines like maybe like a reset, right? Do a reset, screw it. But it's not even so much the reset that pisses me off. It's the fact that Denji is not the same Denji. If you wanted to do a reset, in my opinion, what could have happened? And hear me out. Make it so perhaps Pochita, right? Hear me out. Pochita as a whole dies, right? Whether he gets erased from existence or he gets killed and then he gets rebirthed, whatever the case is, he gets killed. Pochita, the Chainsaw Man, but he's like, they split themselves. They find a way to split Denji and Pochita. So therefore, Pochita dies. Like he's dead. But he'll be reincarnated like in another devil. Why not? But Denji's still alive, or something along the lines like there has to be a choice. Like maybe the Death Devil makes it, but the Death Devil's not even a villain at this point in the story. What I would have wanted it to happen is this: Pochita maybe makes it so everybody forgets about the Chainsaw Man, right? Let's keep that whole notion again, right? Like the whole thing, or I'll erase myself from existence. All right, fine enough. Perhaps that makes it so it undoes the whole him eating the Death Devil and all of this and that and that. And for the benefit of the doubt, let's say that reset happens exactly how everything plays out, right? Denji forgets about everybody forgets about the Chainsaw Man except for Denji. And the reason why is that I would say is that Denji is technically part of the Chainsaw Man, at least in my new ending, right? Or I'm just trying to make it so at least this Denji makes the choice. Like, let's put it this way. There's a scenario where he either has to pick either Asa or Pochita. And he says, sorry, and Pochita, even he's like, you gotta pick me, man. And then Denji's like, I'm sorry, I can't be Chainsaw Man, Pochita. Like, I'm sorry. And then Pochita, they have this, like, the same emotional moment where, this happens. And Pochita proceeds to, eliminate himself and everything gets reset. Perhaps this is the moment where we get like the time reset, right? The reset that we have been shown in the final chapter. But the difference is Denji keeps all of his memories, right? So hear me out. Everything resets, Denji keeps his memories. Now Denji, knowing in retrospect all the choices that have been building up to this point, he knows how to go about them in the right way. And then we might have like a whole scenario playing out where Denji makes the right choices. He proceeds not to join public safety. He meets Power. He befriends Power. He meets Aki. He treats them nice. He knows all of this. He leads them on about like, hey, Makima is not such a good person, man. Like, you should retire, Aki. He tells them all of these things. Eventually, he meets Asa. He tells Asa like, hey, nice to meet you, or something like that. And perhaps they start talking, or Denji knows how to go about life in general. All the losses he's had. Himeno might not die in this part. Makima might be a different Makima, because if there's no Chainsaw Man, there's no crazy Makima trying to like take over the world and why not. So maybe Denji can talk to her and be like, hey, I know what you want. Like, you just want to be like someone to like see you as a friend. Because that's all that, Makima really wanted. She wanted to be treated like equally. She wanted to find equals and friends and all that. Maybe Denji can be able to befriend her. Obviously, he would treat Aki and Power differently, like friends. Maybe, Himeno and Aki can retire peacefully. Himeno can be alive. All these choices lead up to arguably a happy ending, yes, but an ending that makes it so Denji, through all of the experiences he's learned from part 1 and 2, he's able to now be in this new timeline, right? If we're going by the whole basis of like the time reset, right? He's learned all of these experiences. Now he gets to play them, point by point by point. He gets to, like I said, save Power, save Aki, perhaps change Makima, like the way that she goes about life. Save all of these people, and then eventually meet up Asa, and perhaps, even fall in love with her, and, so forward. Or you can have that scene where he does rescue her, And yeah, man, like I think my whole thing with the time reset that I hate the most is that it's not our Denji. That's the big one, right? And it really makes it so reading part 1 and 2 is, like, in my opinion, irrelevant, because like none of those events happen. And it's not even like a stone ocean for spoilers for JoJo's, where we fall in love with these characters, and yes, there is a time reset at the end. However, we put our characters that we love in a better place, and it made sense this time reset because they had already done it. So it was nothing out of the ordinary, and this time reset actually is a better conclusion for the entirety of the story of the Joestars. Like, for many people, part 6 has one of the best endings in all of manga, where the end of Dio, the curse of Dio, is gone. The Joestar lineage of the whole curse, to be fighting Dio eternally, it's over. So I would have wanted something. And then Emporio is the only one that remembers all of this. I don't know. I guess in my wishful thinking, if they did a time reset in Chainsaw Man, which they did like in this final chapter, I wish it would have been something along the lines like a series like Steins Gate, which if you have seen it, you know what I mean, where the main character still knows all of the memories, but nobody else knows about it. Like, nobody else remembers those memories except him. But you might have something along the lines where he makes it so maybe Asa and him meet each other, and maybe Yoru, like, or something makes it so like Asa gets a glimpse, like, you look familiar, or like, I know you, and you might leave it like vague like that, right? But yeah, man, overall, Chainsaw Man part 2, man, what else can I say? It's a series that I followed very passionately for many years that sadly did not live up to the expectations that I had for it, and that's okay. Fujimoto, like I said, probably got burned out. If it definitely felt like that at some points in the story where he just didn't know what he was doing, because he was just probably like, I want to get this over with to move on. I'm already tired. Like, I want to make something. I want to make indie stories. I want to make smaller scale stories. I'm so fed up with writing this big blockbuster title. I want to make my own little stories, because he does make a lot of great one shots. So I feel like he was just burned out in the story, which, like I said, it's a shame, but it is his story. It is his baby. So only he, he had the final say in how the story was going to end. So, in other words, what does a person like myself have to say about that, right? Besides me just complaining for like an hour plus about the story that I didn't like. But yeah, this is my conclusion to the video. If you agree with it, let me know in the comment section down below. If you stick all the way to the end, then you're a real one. I really appreciate it. I would appreciate also if you like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I upload a lot of stuff, not just Chainsaw Man. And going forward, I think this might be my final Chainsaw Man video, because I think I said everything I had to say about part 2 in general, as well as the entirety. Now, don't get it twisted. If there is a part 3, I'll be there day one, because a lot of the criticisms I have might be fixed in part 3, might be not, maybe not, but there's still a chance, right? But yeah, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, like I said, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more anime and manga content in the near future. This is a very off-the-cuff video, like no editing. It was just me looking at the camera, talking to you guys, because I just want to, be very sincere with you guys. I never want to put a front. I never want to be like, oh, I actually love this thing. I'm like, no. Like, if I have issues with something, I'll let you guys know. And this ending, I had a lot of issues with it, so I just wanted to talk to you guys about it, and just have a whole conversation, like break down and tell you guys what I liked about part 2, what I didn't like. Would I suggest Chainsaw Man to people? I think, yeah, in retrospect, I would tell people probably, yeah, read Chainsaw Man part 1 and read Chainsaw Man part 2 at your own discretion. It has a very controversial ending, but if you don't want to deal with that, just read part 1. But I would still say Chainsaw Man is one of my favorite stories of all time that really affected me in an emotional level that I will forever love. It was one of the craziest rides that I've ever had reading a story, and I'll always be grateful for reading this story. Like, even if this was a garbage ending, in my opinion, right? I hate this ending. I never even want to read this story again because I know how the ending is garbage. But man, I'll be lying if I said that, this story will always, I would be lying if I didn't say that this story will forever stick with me in my heart. Like, I'll always have a special soft spot for this story, and its characters and its world and its writing. Even towards the end of part 2, some elements of it. I can't say that I hate Chainsaw Man. I will never say that. I will never say I hate Chainsaw Man or nothing like that. Now, will I say that part 2 for me was a waste of time, and the ending kind of makes this whole story a waste of time? Perhaps I might say that, yeah, sure. But I still love it. I still love it, man. I can't deny that. I still love part 1. I still love Denji as a character. I love Asa. I love these characters. I just hated the conclusion of it. Like, I just wish it would have been better. Similar to like a lot of people say about Game of Thrones. When they hate the final season, like, people will say, oh, the final season is one of the worst things ever in fiction, yada, yada, yada. But they'll always come back by saying, but the show's one of the greatest shows of all time. It's just the ending sucked. And that's how I feel about this story, where I think that Chainsaw Man is one of the best manga series out there to ever be written, but the ending sucked, at least for me. Like I said, many people will have different opinions on it, but in my opinion, I just didn't think this ending landed at all. And, it's okay. If Fujimoto if he makes another work, I'll be there day one. And I know many people in the comment might be like, why would you do that? Like, this guy might be a fraud, yada, yada, yada. Listen, I can only speak for myself, but I'll be there if Fujimoto makes another, story, because if he's passionate to make a new story, that means that he is passionate about it. Maybe in my own thoughts, I thought that perhaps Chainsaw Man Part 2, he wasn't really passionate about it towards the end and he just wanted to end it. But if he has a new idea that he just wants to write, I'll be there, because guess what? There's no expectations in my behalf. As well as I know in him, it'll be a crazy different story. It won't be a battle shonen, that's for sure. Because my man is a very, he can make so many kind of genres in his storytelling. So I believe he said that his next story he wants to write is about like a romance or something like that. I'll read it, man. I'll read it, like a crazy romance harem kind of thing that he said. I'll read it. I'm down for that. So yeah, if Fujimoto, for any reason you're watching this, which I doubt it, but if you were to watch this video all the way to the end, I would say thank you, sir, for the story that you gave us. And even though I hate the ending, I still think that Chainsaw Man is a once in a lifetime kind of like story that you read and you're like, wow, like that was a trip, man. And it's a trip you'll never forget, for better or for worse. But yeah, with all that being said, I think I said everything I had to say. So once again, thank you guys so much for sticking with me to the end of the video. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. And, just keep on dreaming. Just like Pachita says, keep on dreaming, guys. But yeah, with all that being said, hope you guys have a good day. Bye-bye.